singing about?
Man, yes. So I grew up in Connecticut, and my dad had grown up in Gardena, California, which is a really Japanese-American neighborhood. My mom is from Chicago. They met in Chicago, moved to New York, and it was always meant to be a kind of temporary place. But 30 plus years later, they're still in Connecticut. And so I grew up like very happily. I'm one of four kids, and so I think I always saw in my siblings this kind of mini community of sorts. But I have a really clear memory of probably second or third grade when I started taking standardized tests, and you had to fill out, the bubble of your ethnicity or your race, and joking with my dad about like what I was filling in, and him saying to me, Erin, you're not white. And that being this moment of realizing I wasn't exactly the same as everyone around me, and still not really being comfortable understanding what it meant to be Japanese American, biracial, aside from that, my teachers could never pronounce my last name the first day of class. So I think I grew up, and I remember in 11th grade in American history, I always loved my history classes, but feeling really frustrated when we got to a little bit of World War II and Japanese American incarceration, internment, as it was called in our textbooks, was mentioned, and I got this really excited, like, oh, I'm going to get to share, that this impacted my family, and, I knew my grandma had been at Heart Mountain. I didn't know very much beyond that, and then we just skimmed right by it. Didn't even stop. It was like maybe a paragraph off to the side in our textbooks, and that kind of stayed with me as this real frustration. But it wasn't until college that I started really researching this in depth and learning about, the history of this community that I came from. Since starting grad school and since meeting Julian, it's been trying to understand both how Japanese Americans sort of fit into what we think of as this narrative of American history, and the ways that our community being Japanese Americans, has this kind of responsibility to use the platforms that we do have to sort of use that as a lens outward, to think about all of the other histories that we don't learn about, or all of the other histories that, bump into this history that we share within kind of the JA community.
And how have your parents and family responded to you all of a sudden?
Not all of a sudden.
Embracing all this.
We've been joking about that I'm giving my dad an identity crisis, but that's not really true. They're really excited, I think, and not to belittle my Irish side either, because, that part of my family is really important, and some of my happiest memories are of all four of my grandparents being together, and the fact that they loved and respected each other, I think has been so influential in my own life. But I think for my siblings and for my parents, it's been this interesting kind of reflection on all of our identities and what it means to grow up, in New England, what it means to be part of a biracial family. These questions that, we thought about growing up, but not really in depth, at least I didn't. So it's been great. My parents are very supportive.
Mm-hmm.
We did a show in our hometown library before we started tour, and it was mostly like 20 of my parents' friends, and I think for a lot of them it was seeing our family, seeing me, but then our family as like this really Asian American identity that they didn't really put together with us necessarily. My dad is still usually the only Asian guy at like most things that we go to in my hometown, and so it's been interesting, but mostly exciting. And I think a lot of folks have said like, wow, I didn't know this. Didn't know this about your family, didn't know this about this part of our history.
Do you still have family in Gardena?
Yes, I do. My dad's cousins are still there. My dad's brother is around there, and his street is kind of, his old street, West 140th Street, is now a mix of, some of the old Japanese Americans who've been there for, half a century, and then newer families moving in. But yeah, we're going to see them when we're down there, which I'm excited about.
Great.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
And Julian, your story is very different. I mean,
I don't know if there's another one like it.
Weird.
Where do you want to start?
I mean, yeah, so probably the best place to start is like me as a little kid hanging out at Country Music Stars ranches outside Nashville. I think that kind of encapsulates it, That's why I ended up in Nashville, because my dad's in the record business, and he's like one of the old, like Last of the Wild Men record producer, record exec kind of guys. And so I had a really fun childhood where he's an Italian-American, Swedish guy, and had a really wonderful childhood where he just like bestowed upon me Dylan and the Stones and the Beatles and the Beach Boys, all the classic rock stuff, and Neil Young and Joni Mitchell and Hendrix, and a lot of the stuff where my songwriting comes from is a combination of that record collection and growing up in Nashville, just being around Americana, folk music, and then kind of us using it in this different kind of way. And you know, the rub, as far as like an Asian American lens would be, is that I looked like this growing up in Nashville. Right? It's just not an uncommon story otherwise. And I think that's where a lot of the interesting tensions and some of our songs come from, is turning a lens on kids like me, and to Erin, also to kids like Erin for a certain extent, and our collaborators like our friend Diego, who's a PhD at Brown, who works a lot on this project with us, who also grew up in Nashville. He's like an Afro-Cuban Chinese kid, so he's hopeless.
Does he sing?
No, he plays violin.
He raps.
And when he gets drunk, he raps really offbeat.
It's great.
Yeah,
I love it.
And you know, and friends of ours like Kishibashi, the indie rock musician who grew up also in Virginia and lives in Athens now with his family. We joke a lot because when we come to the West Coast, we look at you folks out here and we're like, wow, you guys think you're normal? That's so nice. That must be amazing to have gone to a fucking high school with, you know, 50% Asian kids or people of color even, you know? And because for us, it was like, where were you guys when we were clawing out in the wilderness, you know, trying to find our identity, or more likely kind of like push it down, you know? And I think for both of us, it's not really till school, it's till our educations. Like, Erin had I guess the advantage of going to an actual college. I went to a music college, so I didn't read a lot of books. And it wasn't really till I went to Wyoming for grad school and started studying the Asian American history there at places like Rock Springs and Heart Mountain, where I really then started to look at my own Vietnamese American history. And from there realized that, well, this shouldn't even be Japanese American or Chinese American or Vietnamese history. It should belong to the larger community, and beyond that, just it should be American history. And I think that's one of the parts of this project. A lot of times we do play for these home team crowds, especially on the West Coast, and it's really great to, I think people feel represented sometimes in the songs. They see faces that look like theirs in our visuals. But what's more important is to say, no, the rest of y'all in Wyoming or Idaho or Utah, where these camps were, or in Pennsylvania, where we played a show where there was a Vietnamese refugee resettlement. No, when we can all own that history together, you know, because if we have to take George Washington, you should have to take Heart Mountain.
Right.
You know.
And how has your family responded to your music?
Well, yeah. Dad went to a concert in Nashville. Mom just came to the concert in Portland a couple days ago, and it's definitely different than anything I've done before. They've always been really supportive of my music career because my mom's a painter, my dad's a musician, so there was none of that like, you should be a doctor shit. I was like, now that I'm getting a doctorate, it's kind of like, what are you doing?
What's this?
But yeah, they've responded in a more curious way than when I was just in an indie rock band. Because there's a lot of layers there. I think for both of them, especially having raised me, they didn't quite realize like maybe the time it was to grow up as a person of color in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s in Nashville. You know, what was it? We were staying with Mimi, my 8th grade teacher. You should tell that story.
Yeah, one of Julian's teachers hosted us in Chicago, and she came to our show, and this was in March of last year, and she said, you know, Julian, I never thought of your mom as Vietnamese, as Asian. I just never saw her that way. And I brought this up actually with your mom in Portland, and she was saying, you know, yeah, people eventually knew me as Jacqueline because they didn't really know what to do with a Vietnamese person in Nashville. So it was just kind of like, okay, we'll look at your other identities, which is both cool and then also kind of creates, I think, these weird tensions that bubble up, you know, later on.
Absolutely. I think that sums up a lot about my childhood.